Hey guys, it's Matthew here once again, and today I came to show you what a build looks like when it hits its peak aesthetic levels, I suppose. And the build I'm talking about is Frostbolt with the microtransaction, with some, bit of GMP action, but mostly the threshold jewels, and of course an Elementalist giving us all kinds of Ignite and Prolif. So the idea around the character was to more or less make it similar to Fireball, and just have some good burn damage, have some sweet clear speed, and a really pretty skill. I'm a huge fan of the microtransaction for Frostbolt, but it's never really felt too good up until these recent threshold jewels, which you can have two of, and they give you more projectile speed as they travel further and further, as well as giving you 2 additional projectiles. So for the most part, you can just survive off of 5 Frostbolt projectiles without any additional, but for map clear, as you can see here, I have 9, and quite a lot of the time I'm using GMP just for 9 additional projectiles, which I then supplement with slower projectiles when I want the big single targets instead. But for the most part, this is going to be just an absolute clear speed monster rather than a single target monster like what Fireball was, because the single target scaling isn't quite as substantial since you can't use something like a conk effect, for example. That's just one of the reasons that you won't have quite as much damage here as you will on a Fireball. It is an insanely fun build and it does work quite nicely. It is just a bit of a shame you have to, get rid of cold, I suppose. You can do this as a cold version, but you won't really have the ignites, the prolifs, and the feels good for the skill. So it won't be a very long video. Mostly I'm just going to explain to you guys here how I am scaling this skill and how I've gone about my thought process into going for ignite and what gear I've chosen or method I've chosen to get ignite on my Frostbolt, as well as how I'm scaling my burn. So in the coming days though, there should probably be a few more boss kills and some higher end gameplay. So the basis around the character was to build it somewhat similar to the Fireball character, because it is still somewhat similar to the Fireball sort of skill. It's just that it's coming from a cold base and it's got slightly slower projectile speed. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same freaking thing. It doesn't scale with area, obviously. So, there are minor differences, but, projectiles, and you want to kind of scale it with some GMP action, or getting more projectiles for better clear speed. And then ultimately, if you want good clear speed, good damage, you want to do ignites. So the only real difference is we have to figure out how to get ignite into our build in a way that doesn't matter in the Fireball build, because fire, crit, ignite, easy. Now there is quite a lot of text on the left hand side here that explains a lot about the build. I won't go over everything in the build right now, just mainly how I've tried to build the character. So the important parts are trying to get Prolif into the build and then finding a way to ignite with the cold damage. Now there are several ways of doing that. Currently you can have a cold to fire aspect, which converts 50% of your cold into fire, and then supplement it with some avatar of fire, meaning you're almost, like pretty much 100% fire damage. But the problem with that is you cannot at all take use of elemental equilibrium, because the only damage you deal is fire damage, and as such you never have any other element to make the monster's weak to fire resist, which is why I ended up opting out of that option, because I figure elemental equilibrium is generally the best sort of scaling for burn builds, as it increases your initial hit of the projectile, as well as increasing the burn damage, and it just becomes infinitely better scaling in my experience with these types of builds. Now, a pretty common way of getting ignites into your cold build these days is Hrimburn gloves. So it means your cold damage can now ignite, meaning you don't have to convert anything. You still have 100% cold damage, like we have right now, 15 to 22k cold. You put these on and all of a sudden your cold damage ignites. So what that means is you are still hitting with cold damage, you're scaling off of cold penetration, but your burn is still fire damage. So it gets scaled off of fire damage, elemental damage, projectile damage, since it's still a projectile, or area damage if it's an area skill. Ultimately, it makes it a little awkward to scale, but for the purposes of our passive tree, I've tried to make it as general as possible anyway. You just try and grab elemental damage and, general sort of damage, so both at once. Whereas this cold node here, for example, won't be double dipping at all. It'll only apply to the initial hit, and and not the burn. So a node like this will give you 25 cold to the initial and 25 damage for the fire ignite afterwards, which does become pretty damn good. The problem with these gloves is they add cold damage to spells and attacks, meaning your Orb of Storms is also going to have cold damage attached to it. If you just chuck it on real quick, you can see Orb of Storms now deals 7 to 15 cold damage. And that means Elemental Equilibrium does not work very well for us. Essentially, it just means you will, whenever you have your Orb of Storms down, it's pretty much 100% of the time going to have an extra 25 cold resist instead of a minus 50. Whereas the goal for us is to have Orb of Storms down against most bosses and, you know, tough targets, so that you get minus 50 to cold and minus 50 to fire, getting quite a lot of extra damage from the initial hit and then from the burn. And another problem with these gloves is you then add freezing into the build, which means your Elementalist prolif does not work that well because you don't leave any corpses, and that means you don't prolif very efficiently to, you know, beyond monsters, breaches, all that sort of stuff. So there is a way of building around these, and it can be pretty damn good, but it's not the ultimate setup in my opinion for this, because the goal is basically to turn it into a fireball character. So the gloves certainly are an option, and there is ways to build around them. I'm just not sure it's the optimal way. I leveled with them for quite a bit until I was ready to swap into my ultimate setup, as well as using the Barracks Respite. So Barracks Respite is a alternative way of getting prolif into your build currently for your ignite and shocks, but that's not too important for the build, mostly for the ignite. So it's an alternative way, but it doesn't work the same way as prolif does. It's pretty similar to the way where you'd freeze a corpse. It doesn't really leave corpses behind, it just spreads after you kill them, so it does still do quite a bit of work in these ignite based builds, and it is still pretty efficient to have if you don't have any other prolif, but ultimately it wasn't as good as prolif, and I didn't really like it that much either, because once again it has added fire damage to spells and attacks, which ruins the elemental equilibrium for the fire portion of our skill, meaning I could not really do that with EE either, and ultimately I had to drop both of these in favor of the one true god, the Three Dragons Mask. So all this does is it takes away your cold, chill, and freeze, and replaces it with ignite, essentially giving us a fire-based skill, just like Fireball, only we now have cold scaling and not quite as efficient double dipping. So really this build ends up probably being a worse version of Fireball for single target, but a more fun version for clearing, and probably more efficient for clearing because you do have built-in Pierce and a few other bonuses like the Threshold Jewels right now, which are actually really good for these sorts of builds at the moment. So besides that, for this build right now, I probably won't mention too much more until I decide to make a full sort of guide video about everything about it, when I finally concluded everything to it and tried out a few guardians and stuff, and can truly recommend it. For now, it's been a very fun map clearer, and it's been very efficient for that. It hasn't been too expensive so far. The MTX is probably one of my favorite MTXs in the game, and the sound that Frostbolt makes is truly just So yeah, there's not much else to mention other than we're building it pretty damn similar to the Fireball I've already made a guide on, and not really anything too important besides that catalyst for some early damage scaling, a Skin of the Loyal, can't go wrong with one of those, and I'm hitting about 8300 ES at the moment. Depending how much you want, you can get more, you can go less. So I'll leave it at that for now, and hopefully have a better update on the character in the next few days. Hope you enjoyed the video, thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.